The seamstress and the silence, they say she was the finest seamstress in all of Whitechapel, and that her fingers moved like wind over silk, stitching dreams into ivory lace and soft layers of tulle. Her name was Eliza Harrow, though in most records she appears only as E. Draped across her sewing chair like a bride who died on the altar, its hem kissed the dusty floor, stained faintly at the edge with something no one dared name. And from that year onward, something peculiar began to happen. Tales of cursed gowns, specifically gowns made of a particular kind of fabric passed from laundress to Lady S maid. If it has green dye, they'd whisper, don't let her wear it. And always in hushed tones, arsenic, arsenic in the silk, arsenic in the lace, they called it. A brilliant, mesmerizing pigment invented at the tail end of the 18th century, glowing like sunlit moss and envy itself. It adorned everything wallpaper, of course. Some were pure white. Others claimed she was institutionalized after screaming in a fit of fury that every bride is already a corpse. But her dress, the cursed masterpiece, did not vanish. But beneath the official story was another tale, spreading quietly, dangerously, a tale about the dress, a tale about the green, a tale that, over time, began to infect the very soul of Victorian womanhood. It was sold, repackaged, and unknowingly sent to a shop in Bath, where a rich merchant's daughter would be its first and final bride. But even white was not safe. Bleaching agents in the era were brutal. Chloride of lime, mercuric nitrate, formaldehyde, the body endured these things not as enhancements but as wounds disguised. And when sweat met these substances in the heat of dancing or lovemaking, because better to die beautiful and married, they thought, than to live plain and alone. They leached into the bloodstream like ghosts returning home. Gloves she had watched her sister Carolyn waste away after marrying a barrister in a fine green-trimmed gown. Watched the bruises bloom like violets up her neck and wrists. The doctors had called it wedding fever. Eliza had called it murder. Her final design, then her masterpiece, had not been a gown for a bride, but a funeral shroud for a culture obsessed with purity. She had stitched her rage into every seam, packed the bodice with arsenic-laced lace, sewn thin veins of dye into the corset channels. A gown to punish a society that devoured its daughters in the name of beauty, candies, even children's toys. But it was arsenic-based. A whispering killer that clung to fabric and walls and lungs alike. The problem was known but conveniently ignored. The factories that produced these dyes left men coughing blood into their aprons. Children working as dyers lost their teeth, their hair. Women handling the fabrics began to waste away. But the color sold, it sold better than anything before it, and so it stayed. Brides, young and radiant, newly dressed in white, began to fall ill on their wedding nights. Was considered the pinnacle of quiet opulence, invisible to the guests, but intimate against the bride's skin. A final luxury only she and her husband would see, a love letter in pigment, a death sentence sewn into every stitch. They'd stumble at the reception, lips pale, hands trembling. Some collapsed before vows were said, others hours after consummation. But the pattern was clear, a growing list of young women, always in their wedding gowns, struck down by sudden and unexplained ailments. Harrow, milliner's apprentice, as if even the ink was reluctant to write her fate in full. But the mothers knew. They'd watched their daughters wither in satin sleeves, and their wails pierced the gaslit London nights far more sharply than the church bells that announced another wedding. In 1857, when the mists over London curled like ghostly fingers through the cobblestones, Eliza completed her final wedding gown, a gown so exquisite. They whispered it could make a barren woman fertile or turn the heart of a miser to gold. But before it was worn, she vanished. Vanished, yes, but not without a trace. The gown remained. For to be beautiful was not simply to be admired, it was to be morally superior. A woman's worth was measured by the whiteness of her skin, the purity of her linens, the fragility of her form. The paler she was, the more delicate, the more angelic. And there was no color so beloved, so deadly as emerald green. Doctors offered polite lies, overexcitement, fevers of the nerves, spiritual exhaustion. What began as quiet grief grew into something more whispered, more urgent. But what sort of society poisons its own brides? To understand that, one must understand the madness of beauty in the Victorian age. Shields green, it stayed in gloves and gowns, and most dangerously in the petticoats and linings of wedding dresses. For green lace, threaded beneath the outer white, not all gowns were green-lined, Eliza Harrow had known. But before it reached its wearer, Eliza disappeared. Some say she drowned herself in the Thames, her fingers stained green. Her death made the headlines. Tragic collapse during vows, the newspaper read, and yet still they wore them, the gowns, the veils, the corsets soaked in powdered pearl and poisoned white. And so the silence continued, until one day a doctor in London's East End made a discovery that would shake the empire. The doctor and the dressmaker, his name was Dr. Silas Wren, a man of peculiar habits and questionable renown. He kept no wife, no children, no pets, only a library of anatomical sketches and a single velvet armchair that faced a wall of yellowing case notes. He lived on Bread Street, above a candle shop, and most days his services were requested not by the rich, but by those whose dead had died too strangely to be buried without questions. And that is precisely why, in the summer of 1863, a weeping father from Westbourne Grove appeared at his door with a bundle of white silk wrapped like a corpse. "My daughter," the man stammered. She wore this once, just once. Her fingertips had been stained green, the tissue beneath her nails a vivid chartreuse. That body had come from a hat factory in Shoreditch. Now here was a bride, a daughter of society, dressed to the nines, dead before the honeymoon. You see, arsenic was not yet banned in fashion. Its danger was acknowledged in medical circles, but considered manageable by society's elite. And what's more, no family wanted to believe their daughter had died from the very thing they'd spent months and fortunes acquiring. Silas unwrapped the cloth slowly, his fingers tracing the delicate needlework along the bodice. The dress had the scent of perfume and sweat and something else, something metallic, bitter. It shimmered faintly even in the dim gaslight. Wren was mocked in the press. Satirical illustrations showed him dissecting ball gowns like cadavers. He was nicknamed the Dress Butcher. Invitations to speak were revoked. Funding disappeared. The candle shop below him burned mysteriously one night. And still more girls died. A name not found in medical journals, but in whispers among the seamstresses and laundresses of London. She could smell arsenic through 4 layers of muslin. She used cabbage leaves to test dyes, watching for bruises in the veins. To the rich, she was invisible. To the poor, she was a lifeline, a woman called Lacey Madeline. She ran a hidden workshop under a boarded-up apothecary in Lambeth, where she taught girls not only how to sew, but how to survive. She was a dressmaker, yes, but also something far older, far quieter, a keeper of secret knowledge. Dressmakers continued to order bolts of green silk from merchants who had long stopped asking questions. He had seen many fine things in his day, but this gown unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Each wore gowns trimmed in imported emerald ribbon. No investigation followed. The family buried them all under white marble, with no mention of color. "She died the night of her wedding," the man whispered. "She sewed the names into a quilt, hundreds of them. Names lost to time, stitched into the fabric of forgotten rebellion." It was rejected from every medical journal in London. One editor wrote back, "You propose ghosts and gowns, doctor. England has no room for fairy tales?" Wren analyzed them, catalogued the chemicals, tried to understand the thresholds. His belongings were burned by city officials, except for one item, a bridal gown folded neatly in a case. The hem had been altered, the lining removed. In place of lace, there were pages, tiny scraps of his notes, sewn like a hidden message into the bodice. But each dress told a different story. Some brides had died instantly, others weeks later. The doses varied, the symptoms danced. What remained constant was the silence. No signs of illness, no trauma, but her skin turned ... green. But in Wren's journals, years later discovered in the attic of a collapsed home in Kensington, there was a single entry written in spidery ink. He scraped the threads with a silver scalpel, dissolved a square inch of lining in distilled water, and placed the solution under his microscope. What he saw was not cloth, it was venom masquerading as fashion. The dye was Scheele's green arsenic trioxide to be precise. Absorbed through the skin, inhaled as dust, even more potent when mixed with heat and moisture. Green, that word stirred something in Dr. Wren. He had once dissected a young girl who died after weeks of violent coughing and bleeding from the gums. Dr. Wren examined the gown for hours. In essence, the dress had been a slow-moving dagger. A beautiful silken assassin. Word of Wren's discovery spread quickly, but only underground. To say a wedding dress was a murder weapon was to suggest that the entire empire, its industries, its artisans, its sense of beauty was complicit in ritual slaughter. The backlash came swiftly, but Wren was not alone. There was another. They said Madeleine could look at a bodice and tell you how long its wearer had before the poison took hold. Wren sought her out. Their meeting was never recorded in official histories. No, she always knew. Says the rot is in the lace, but the sickness is in the hunger. They'd rather die than look plain. Together they worked in secret. Lacey Madeleine provided samples, scraps from the dresses she salvaged, worn petticoats, gloves pulled from dead girls' hands. Because no one wanted to hear the truth. Mothers kept the gowns in cedar chests. Fathers paid priests to blame frailty of the womb or melancholic fits. And so the dead brides mounted. In 1865, there was a wedding in Oxfordshire where the entire bridal party, sisters and 2 cousins, collapsed within days of the ceremony. Later that same year, Wren attempted to publish a paper entitled On the Lethality of Decorative Arsenicals in Female Matrimonial Garments. But Lacey Madeleine kept the records. She documented every death, every swatch, every bridal shoe taken from a stiffened foot. When Wren died in 1868, he left no will. The message read, if you wear this dress, you wear their silence. And so it passed, this cursed knowledge from scholar to dressmaker, from corpse to cotton. But still, the world refused to see. Because to question the dress was to question the bride. And in Victorian England, that was a question no one dared ask. The House of Ashes there stood, at the edge of Wiltshire Downs, a manor house swallowed by ivy and neglect. It was called Greymoor, though no one remembered why. The villagers spoke its name with unease, like a curse only half forgotten. She returned at 21, summoned by the death of her father Silas Bellamy, heir to a family legacy that no longer sparkled in society pages, but instead whispered through morgues and lunatic asylums. She found the manor empty of kin, but full of dresses. Wedding gowns from every decade, every fashion, every tragedy. Some still bore the perfume of their owners. Others smelled faintly of vinegar and death. Honora moved through them like a mourner in a mausoleum of silk. A place of silence, they said, where wind never touched the trees and windows watched even when shuttered. At first they were cordial, technical discussions of lace weight, dye sources, regional silk behaviors. But then the tone shifted. It had once belonged to the Bellamy family lace barons, dressmakers to duchesses, their fortunes sewn into the hem of empire. But now, Greymoor rotted in stillness. And it was there, in the winter of 1872, that a girl named Honora Bellamy returned to uncover the truth that had long festered in satin folds. Honora had been sent away to Paris at 12, a curious child with ink-stained fingers and a tongue too sharp for drawing rooms. The portraits in the hall showed a woman too pale, too delicate to survive. In every frame she wore white. But there was one painting hidden in the attic, beneath a moth-eaten drape. It showed the wedding day. She pressed it to her nose. The bitter almond scent struck her instantly. She dropped it, gasping, coughing. Her eyes watered not with grief but with truth. Her mother's eyes bright with the fever of youth, her cheeks flushed with rouge. And at her neck barely visible unless you looked closely, a green lace choker like a serpent of silk, hundreds of them. She piled them in the garden, doused them with turpentine, and lit the match with her mother's monogrammed hairpin. The flames devoured greedily. Silk wailed like a banshee as it burned, and the wind carried the scent of arsenic across the valley. The villagers came running, but by then the fire had already reached the house. Displayed for a time in the Royal Costume Collection under the name Bride of Greymoor, visitors claimed to feel ill near it. One curator collapsed while arranging the veil. Another reported rashes, nightmares, sudden nosebleeds. Mothers warned daughters not to wear anything they hadn't touched themselves. And slowly, painfully, the tide turned. Arsenic-based dyes were banned. Regulations on fabric production tightened. Beauty, but from the very dresses meant to make them beautiful, at last was forced to reckon with its cost. A scientist later confirmed the lace was laced with arsenic at lethal concentration. The dress was removed from display. Its whereabouts now are unknown. In long hallways across rusted banisters, sealed behind glass like holy relics, dressed in a wedding gown so perfect it seemed to glow, no soot, no scorch, just pristine white silk with a faint shimmer of emerald thread running along the hem. Or perhaps he had just not in words. In a separate drawer, Honora found a bolt of green lace. Still vibrant, still wicked. Their fortune was built not on fashion, but on funerals. And every stitch had been sewn with silence. Wrapped around it was a wedding band. Her mother's, in the library, behind a false panel. She found the records, ledgers, letters, measurements, names, one name repeated more than any other. Lacey Madeline. Others say she died penniless in a London asylum, screaming about green ghosts in white gowns, but the fire was real. And so was what it unearthed. There was a correspondence over 60 letters exchanged between Lacey and her father. They know, Silas, the blood tests confirm it. You must stop production. The green must go. If they wear it, it is not beauty. It is betrayal. Her father had not responded to those final letters. Honora had no memory of her mother. She died 1 week after that painting was made, but Honora knew better. Her hands, trembling, traced the same lace now curled in her lap like a sleeping snake. The official cause, lung infection, the Bellamys had known. They had sold poison to princesses, to duchesses, to girls barely old enough to bleed. Honora burned it all, the gowns, the lace, the ledgers. Graymore crumbled by dawn. Honora disappeared. No record exists of her after that night. Some claim she joined a convent in Ireland. For in the ashes, firefighters found something strange. A mannequin, untouched by flame. The dress was taken to London. But the legend grew. It found its way into plays, poems, protest leaflets. Seamstresses sewed protective charms into their garments. But the bodies were already buried. And in their graves a question remained. How many brides died not from love or childbirth or disease, but from the very dresses meant to make them beautiful? The bride in the bargain, there is a photograph, sepia-toned, faint with age of a young bride standing at the foot of a great staircase. Her gown is simple, unadorned save for a single ribbon of green trailing down from her waist. The photograph was discovered in the lining of a coffin during a restoration of the Highgate Cemetery vaults in 1912. The coffin held a woman of no significant estate, no known family, no marriage certificate. Yet she was dressed in bridal white, and wrapped around her wrists, beneath the gloves, were faint green bruises. Her eyes, caught by the shutter's gaze, are half closed, as though she were caught between waking and sleep, life and something beyond it. They had never heard of Eliza Harrow, or Dr. Silas Wren, or the seamstress beneath Lambeth. But they knew enough to seal the gown in an airtight box and send it to the Natural History Museum under a different name. Sample 27B. Unknown textile, suspected contamination. On the back of the photograph, in delicate cursive, are the words, to remember that beauty is not always a blessing. A silent agreement between society and its women, that to be desirable was to be delicate, and to be delicate was to be disposable. The gowns changed, bustles widened, sleeves puffed, colors shifted with the tides of fashion, but the hunger remained. The hunger to be seen, to be worthy, to be chosen, even if it meant vanishing inside the very dress that was supposed to celebrate life. That pain could be endured if wrapped in beauty. That suffering was noble, even romantic, if it came dressed in white. That arsenic no longer hides in our seams or lingers in our cosmetics. And yet, in every fitting room, a shadow remains. Not of poison, but of expectation, of weightless waists, of ageless skin. Of bridal magazines filled with airbrushed phantoms, a scent of powder and something bitter, a question that echoes through every stitch and seam. The bride's name is unknown. The archivists who uncovered the image did not know the story of Graymore. It was never displayed, never catalogued, never spoken of again. But the whispers continued. It does not name names. It does not tell tales. It simply reads. They spoke of a pact made long ago, not written in ink, but in expectation. It was not just arsenic that killed those brides. It was the weight of that bargain. For every girl who walked down the aisle with trembling steps, corset drawn so tight her lungs could barely whisper, lips painted with crushed beetles, cheeks flushed with powders made of lead, there was no promise of safety. There was only the illusion of perfection. One designed by men, maintained by mothers, and sold in tailors' shops for 50 guineas and a grave, and yet still they came, year after year. Bride after bride, they say now that history moves forward, that we are wiser, safer, perhaps that is the modern curse. We no longer die in our wedding dresses. We just slowly disappear inside them. There is a small plaque, barely legible, in a forgotten corner of the Victoria and Albert Museum, in memory of those whose beauty became their burial. And if you stand there long enough, in the quiet hush of antique silks and whispered memories, you might hear the rustle of a hem behind you. How many brides were ever truly alive the day they said, "I do"? Because perhaps they were already ghosts. Not the wailing kind, not the ones with chains, but the silent ones, the beautiful ones, dressed in white, and doomed from the moment the first thread met the needle.